Thank you very much indeed. It's my huge pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Dov Waxman. Dov is the Gilbert Foundation Professor of Israel Studies and a Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Los Angeles. Although this is something of an away fixture for Dov, it's been held in a neutral venue. I say that because Dov is also an honorary research fellow here at the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism. And his writings are wide-ranging and encompass the fields of contemporary antisemitism, Israel-Palestine, American Jewish politics, and US-Israel relations. All of this is reflected in the large number of publications he has authored, which include 4 books, the most recent of which was The Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, What Everyone Needs to Know, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Most excitingly, Dov has a new book which will be coming out in the autumn of next year, 2026, and it'll be published by Princeton University Press. The working title, I'm told, for that book is Antisemitism and Israel-Palestine, a Critical Guide. We're thrilled that Dov will be speaking tonight on that very book and drawing on a couple of chapters from it. And the title of his lecture, as you can see on the screen here, is The Moral Panic About Antisemitism on College Campuses. In this lecture, he will consider not only the phenomenon of antisemitism on US campuses, but also the way it's become a subject of political intervention and controversy, with far-reaching consequences. So it really is with great anticipation and excitement that we welcome Dov to BISA. Welcome, Dov.
Thank you, Brendan. I also want to thank Brendan and David Feldman and everybody at BISA for really being such a welcoming home for me over the past 6 months or so as I've been on my sabbatical from UCLA. It's really been a wonderful experience to be here in London. As you've probably gathered, this is my hometown, so it's a homecoming of sorts. And it's really been wonderful to be part of the community here at the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism. And also, quite frankly, it's been a welcome respite from living in the United States. Every day, it seems, in the United States brings alarming news. The Trump administration has been deploying soldiers on the streets of American cities, sending masked federal agents to round up undocumented immigrants, and steadily undermining the guardrails of American democracy. So I've been at home over the past 6 months teaching at my home institution, University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. I would have really worried about ICE agents storming into my class to arrest my students, which has happened on some campuses. And I teach a course on Middle East politics at UCLA, so many of my students come from the Middle East and have real concerns about being swept up in this in ICE raids. I would have also been in numerous faculty meetings with colleagues who had just lost their research grants that were abruptly suspended by the Trump administration, which froze nearly $600 million worth of research grants to UCLA alone. Thankfully, those grants have been temporarily restored by a federal judge. And this was after the Department of Justice in July alleged that UCLA, my institution, had violated federal civil rights laws by not adequately addressing anti-Semitism on its campus, particularly during the pro-Palestinian protests and the encampment that took place there last year. The Trump administration not only froze those research funds to UCLA, but also demanded that UCLA pay $1.2 billion. That's $1.2 billion, you heard that right, in fines. This is a staggering amount of money for any university to pay, but particularly for a public university such as UCLA. It's more than double what the Trump administration has demanded from Harvard, and more than 6 times what Columbia University has already agreed to pay. This fine, others like it, is nothing less than extortion. If UCLA capitulates, like Columbia did, and agrees to pay this fine, it will financially cripple the university, drive up tuition fees for undergraduates, drastically reduce the number of PhD students the university can admit, and most likely force it to lay off staff and contingent faculty. Thankfully, since I have tenure, I'm likely to keep my job. But my ability to teach my classes in the way that I'm used to doing may be severely compromised. To restore its funding, Columbia's administration agreed, for example, to place a senior administrator over one of its departments to supervise the hiring in that department and the curriculum taught in that department being the Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies department. Now, as somebody who teaches Middle East politics and also a course on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I may well find my own syllabi, my own coursework under review, perhaps by UCLA's administration and possibly even by the federal government. But even if that doesn't happen, I must admit that I'm anxious about returning to teach my courses on a campus that is now patrolled by police officers and private security guards, and where security is tight and students and faculty alike feel that they are under constant surveillance. So what made UCLA and other universities, other so-called elite universities in particular, a target for the Trump administration? What made it a target was the allegation that it is a hotbed of anti-Semitism. But what the administration, the Trump administration, is demanding UCLA do, and other institutions like it, in addition to paying extortionate sums of money, is implement wide-ranging policy changes that have little, if anything, to do with anti-Semitism, such as ending its diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, altering its admissions policies to make sure it doesn't allow any form of affirmative action, and changing its policies on transgender athletes and students. It has made similar demands of other universities. Some, notably Columbia, as I've said, also Cornell, Brown University, the University of Pennsylvania, and the University of Virginia, and most recently Northwestern University, have already made deals with the Trump administration to restore their research funds and implement the kinds of changes that the Trump administration demanded. Harvard is currently fighting this in court, and as far as I know, UCLA is currently negotiating with the Trump administration. The administration has not only made unprecedented demands on universities, pressured them, as I said, with these funding threats, and extorted payments of hundreds of millions of dollars, it has also tried to track down, detain, and deport foreign students and scholars for allegedly supporting Hamas and spreading anti-Semitism. Hundreds of international students and recent graduates who were legally in the United States have had their visas, their student visas, or their green cards summarily revoked by the Trump administration. A few were detained for months, most notably, most famously, Mahmoud Khalil, a green card holder who was one of the leaders of the protests at Columbia University in the spring of 2024. He was arrested by ICE agents at his apartment building in New York and held in a detention facility for 3 months before a federal judge ruled that he must be released, and he's still fighting his deportation. By targeting foreign students and accusing them of supporting Hamas and spreading anti-Semitism, the Trump administration is implementing parts of a plan called Project Esther. This was a plan that was drawn up before the 2024 US presidential election and put forward by the influential right-wing think tank, the Heritage Foundation, which has also been in the news lately. I won't discuss the controversy there, but happy to talk about that in the Q&A. This plan, the Project Esther, purports to provide, quote, a blueprint to counter anti-Semitism in the United States. In reality, it is a blueprint for suppressing pro-Palestinian activism in the United States. claiming that pro-Palestinian groups had, quote, infiltrated their ideology into the US education system across all levels, and that, quote, the US education system fosters anti-Semitism under the guise of pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist narratives across universities, high schools, and elementary schools, end quote. The plan proposed, among other things, purging pro-Palestinian, quote, propaganda from curricula, firing pro-Palestinian faculty and staff, deporting pro-Palestinian students, staff, and faculty who are not US citizens, which, as I've said, is what the Trump administration has been trying to do, banning pro-Palestinian groups from college campuses, and preventing them from raising money or even using social media. Taking these actions, the plan proposed, would dismantle the Hamas support network, as it's called, inside the US, that is, the pro-Palestine movement, within 2 years. This is what the plan's authors proposed. And without explicitly saying so, the Trump administration has basically been acting on this plan, attempting to suppress and ultimately eradicate pro-Palestinian campus activism. So, under the guise of combating campus anti-Semitism, the Trump administration has been carrying out a harsh crackdown on pro-Palestinian campus activism, as well as an unprecedented attack against universities because of their failure to tackle anti-Semitism on their campuses. And the Trump administration has tried to publicly justify all of this by claiming that its actions are aimed at protecting Jewish students from rampant anti-Semitism on college campuses. In making this claim and in trying to justify its draconian actions by referring to campus anti-Semitism, the Trump administration is cynically exploiting real fears and genuine concerns about campus anti-Semitism, something that I think most Jewish Americans, at least according to the surveys, can see through. Most of them, for example, in a recent survey, 72% of Jewish Americans believed that the Trump administration is using campus anti-Semitism as a, quote, excuse to punish universities. What provided the Trump administration with this excuse and has effectively enabled it to carry out its assault on universities and on pro-Palestinian speech, I argue, is a moral panic that occurred over campus anti-Semitism during the course of the previous academic year. It was this moral panic that gave rise to the dominant narrative that there is a crisis of anti-Semitism on American college campuses, and it is this narrative that gave the Trump administration the perfect pretext to target universities and pro-Palestinian students. In other words, I'm arguing that there hadn't been a moral panic over campus anti-Semitism, the Trump administration wouldn't have been able to exploit it for its own purposes, or at least it would have found it much harder to do so and encountered more resistance. In short, the moral panic made pro-Palestinian students and universities, particularly elite universities, a convenient target for the Trump administration. Now, I want to be very clear. By characterizing it as a moral panic, I am not suggesting that anti-Semitism is not a problem on college campuses. Anti-Semitism, I want to be clear, does occur on college campuses, is present on college campuses, just as other forms of racism also occur on college campuses and are also present on college campuses, such as Islamophobia and anti-Black racism. Anti-Semitism is also a genuine and growing concern for Jewish students, and this needs to be acknowledged. However, the extent and severity of anti-Semitism on American college campuses, I'm not talking about British college campuses, but I'm sure we'll have some questions about that. The extent of anti-Semitism on American college campuses, I think, has been wildly exaggerated. It is certainly not more prevalent on college campuses in the United States than it is elsewhere in the United States. Very few college students are anti-Semitic, according to surveys. The surveys show, in fact, that college students and graduates are actually less likely to harbor traditional anti-Semitic beliefs than Americans are in general. Nor have there been more anti-Semitic incidents occurring on college campuses than elsewhere. In 2021 and 2022, for example, just under 6% of the total number of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States recorded by the Anti-Defamation League took place on college campuses. Now, there are approximately 350,000 Jewish students on American campuses, which is probably more than the entire size of the Jewish community, Jewish population in the United Kingdom. And there are around 4,000 colleges and universities in the United States. So it's very important to stress that there is no uniform Jewish experience on college campuses. And Jewish students on college campuses are not a homogeneous group. They're a diverse group. Surveys of Jewish students that have been carried out over the past decade, though, indicate that most do not experience anti-Semitism on their campuses, whether in classrooms or in dorm rooms. And they certainly don't encounter the pervasive hostility or live in fear that some claim they do. For example, and I just refer to a few of these surveys, nearly a decade ago, a 2016 survey of Jewish students at 50 universities and colleges with large Jewish student populations found that at most schools, Jewish students felt secure and did not experience hostility. A 2021 survey of Jewish undergraduate students enrolled in 220 four-year colleges and universities across the United States found that 7 out of 10 students reported feeling safe on campus, and 2/3 felt that their campus was welcoming and supportive of Jewish students. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that Jewish students never experience anti-Semitism or that it's not a problem. A survey that was conducted 2 years ago, before Hamas's attack on October the 7th, found that roughly 1 in 5 Jewish students said they had directly experienced what they considered anti-Semitism, either on their campus, or in a campus social environment. And more than 1 in 4 said they had witnessed anti-Semitic incidents, the most common being microaggressions, hate speech, and vandalism. A second survey that was conducted after October the 7th and during the war in Gaza in late 2023 found that 6% of Jewish students reported being personally targeted with anti-Semitic comments, slurs, or threats in a classroom environment, and 11% said they had experienced such comments in a campus social environment. And another survey in the spring of 2024, when campus protests against Israel's war in Gaza were at their height, that found that a slightly higher percentage of Jewish students reported experiencing anti-Semitic comments in a campus social environment or classroom environment. Growing numbers of Jewish students over the course of that academic year also said that they perceived a hostile environment toward Jews on their campus and that they felt less comfortable with others on their campus knowing that they're Jewish. It's worth noting that Jewish students with a stronger emotional connection to Israel were more likely to think there was a hostile environment towards Jews on their campus and were more concerned about anti-Semitism on their campuses than Jewish students who were less emotionally connected to Israel. What these surveys and others like them indicate is that anti-Semitism is a problem on American college campuses and that it worsened during the war in Gaza, as it did everywhere. But the majority of Jewish students did not personally experience anti-Semitism. For most Jewish students on most American campuses, particularly elite ones in universities and colleges, it is not anti-Semitism that they encounter, but anti-Zionism. While college students tend to be less anti-Semitic than Americans in general, they are much more likely to be anti-Zionist, though I want to note most students are not anti-Zionists. And I think this is largely because many students tend to view the Israel-Palestine issue through the lens of a progressive worldview that divides the world into oppressed and oppressors and casts Zionists as the oppressors and Palestinians as the oppressed. They also tend to look at it through an anti-racist lens that connects the Palestinian struggle to a larger global struggle against white supremacy. So when all Zionists are regarded as oppressors and or white supremacists, it's hardly surprising that those deemed Zionists on college campuses, where the students or professors can become targets of opprobrium, disdain, and even hatred. Indeed, for some pro-Palestinian students and perhaps some faculty as well, Zionist has become an epithet, a slur that is hurled at anyone who does not accept the view that Israel is an irredeemably racist state and an inherently illegitimate product of settler colonialism. Since this applies to most Jews on college campuses, including Jews who are quite critical of the Israeli government, it means that many end up being tarred as Zionists and therefore deserving of condemnation. So the vilification of Israel and Zionism on campuses can lead, and sometimes does lead, to the vilification of its supporters, or even to anyone who refuses to denounce Israel or disavow their connections with it. Although hostility towards Israel and Zionism on college campuses is generally not driven by anti-Semitism, it can still create a climate on campus that some Jewish students experience as hostile to them. Students who are strongly opposed to Israel, for example, are often unwilling to be friends with anyone who believes Israel has a right to exist or who supports Israel's continued existence as a Jewish state, which surveys show includes the majority of Jewish students. So this effectively means that they do not want to be friends with most Jewish students. And consequently, Jewish students who identify as Zionists or who simply refuse to denounce Zionism can find themselves socially shunned, ostracized, and even excluded from extracurricular activities and campus clubs. And this has been happening, at least on some campuses, for a while, but it became much more common during the war in Gaza, when hostility toward Israel intensified and became much more widespread. Jewish students lost friends, were bullied in some cases, felt more isolated, and some who publicly identified as Zionists were vilified and harassed. Although not generally motivated by anti-Semitism, these distressing experiences felt anti-Semitic to many Jewish students, for whom Zionism is a core constitutive element of their Jewish identity. When Zionists are socially excluded on campuses, Jewish students can experience this as anti-Semitism because Zionism is part of their Jewish identity. And similarly, when Zionism is denounced, many Jewish students may experience this as an attack on their Jewishness for the same reason. Now, I want to be clear, not all Jewish students experience this. Not all Jewish students identify as Zionists. But as I said, surveys show that many Jewish students do have an emotional attachment to Israel and do believe that rejecting, for example, Israel's right to exist is anti-Semitic. And so they experience these things as anti-Semitism. Now, this experience may well be, and in many cases is, discomforting and upsetting, but it is not the same as being physically unsafe, nor is feeling unsafe the same as being physically unsafe. Many Jewish students said that they felt less safe on their campuses during the 2023-24 academic year. In one survey, for example, a majority, 56% of Jewish students, said they feared for their safety after October the 7th. Now, the fear that they experienced was real, but were they really in physical danger on their campuses? In a couple of surveys of Jewish students, very few actually reported experiencing threats to their physical safety, and only around 1% reported experiencing an anti-Semitic attack. Of course, the fact that only a very small number of Jewish students were physically threatened or assaulted is still unacceptable. Just one anti-Semitic attack is too many, and it only takes one to occur on a campus for many Jewish students to feel afraid or intimidated. Nevertheless, it seems that the fear that many Jewish students undoubtedly felt, particularly when pro-Palestinian protests took place on campuses, was largely unwarranted in the sense that they were not in physical danger. These protests were not directed against Jewish students, and despite a few exceptions, the protests were overwhelmingly peaceful, even though the rhetoric was often radical and militant, and to the ears of most Jewish students, anti-Semitic. When these student-led protests, which the protesters regarded as protests against Israel's genocide in Gaza, took place, as they often did, university administrators then were faced with a difficult, if not impossible, challenge. On the one hand, they had to allow students to peacefully protest on their campuses, which is a legal requirement for public universities and a long-held norm for private universities. On the other hand, they also had to ensure that all students, including Jewish students who supported Israel, felt safe on their campuses and were not harassed, which is also a legal requirement for universities to prevent anti-Jewish harassment and discrimination. So by permitting the protests, university administrators were frequently accused of jeopardizing the safety of Jewish students. And by failing to ban or punish what was deemed anti-Semitic speech at these protests, they were accused of enabling or even encouraging anti-Semitism on their campus. They were even accused of being anti-Semitic themselves because they were previously willing to censor the speech of students and faculty when it offended or threatened students belonging to other minority groups on campus. These accusations became increasingly common and vituperative over the course of that academic year. They came not only from some Jewish students and faculty, but also and especially from alumni, donors, trustees, activists, commentators, and politicians. This collective outcry over what was dubbed campus anti-Semitism was so vociferous, and the concern over campus anti-Semitism so intense that it became a moral panic. And this moral panic turned the problem of campus anti-Semitism into a major crisis and a burning national issue. In fact, it even shifted public and political attention from what was happening in Gaza to what was happening on American college campuses. And, as I mentioned at the outset, it resulted in repression, first by university administrations and then by the Trump administration. I want to say something about a moral panic then. A moral panic happens not when there is no threat. It's not the idea that there is no problem or no threat to begin with, but rather when a threat, an existing problem or threat, is hyped up into a major problem, resulting in heightened public concern, fear, or even hysteria. The threat or the problem is seen as completely out of proportion to its actual size or risk. Moral panics also often involve increased levels of hostility toward a certain group, whose behavior is seen as threatening to the values of or safety of a society, and who are therefore collectively designated as the enemy. For this reason, moral panics often focus on young people and on people who are stereotyped because of their race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, nationality, or religion, which was evident, for example, in past moral panics over muggings, satanic cults, and rap music. This also applies to the moral panic over campus anti-Semitism, which focused on young people, college students, and especially on Arab, Palestinian, and Muslim students, thereby drawing on Islamophobia and on negative stereotypes of Arabs and Palestinians as terrorists, extremists, and anti-Semites. The process of a moral panic was first described by the criminologist Stanley Cohen in his 1972 book, Folk Devils and Moral Panics. Cohen coined the term moral panic, and he wrote, this is a rather long quote, so bear with me, it occurs when, quote, a condition, episode, person, or group of persons emerges to become defined as a threat to societal values and interests. Its nature is presented in a stylized and stereotypical fashion by the mass media. The moral barricades are manned by editors, bishops, politicians, and other right-thinking people. Socially accredited experts pronounce their diagnoses and solutions. Ways of coping are evolved or more often resorted to. Sometimes the object of the panic is quite novel, and at other times it is something which has been in existence long enough, but suddenly appears in the limelight. Sometimes the panic passes over and is forgotten. At other times, it has more serious and long-lasting repercussions and might produce such changes as those in legal and social policy, or even in the way that society conceives itself. That was Stanley Cohen's kind of brief definition of a moral panic. So as Cohen noted in that definition, the mass media and politicians in particular are key actors in creating moral panics. By sensationalizing and amplifying a supposed threat, portraying it in simplistic ways and exaggerating it, the media stokes widespread public concern and a sense of collective alarm. Nowadays, social media can also play a role in stoking moral panics because it fuels public outrage by promoting posts that generate the most user responses. And politicians exacerbate and exploit moral panics by moralizing about their perceived threat and dramatizing the threat, vowing to restore law and order and proposing new policies or laws to tackle it, which typically result in increased policing and repression. In the case of the moral panic over campus anti-Semitism, the mass media, social media, and politicians all played a role. The mass media's coverage of protests shapes the dominant public narrative about them. And in the case of the media's coverage of the campus protests, they promoted the dominant narrative that they threatened Jewish students and made campuses unsafe places for them. Alarmist headlines in the press ramped up the sense of a crisis of anti-Semitism on college campuses, and anti-Semitic incidents occurring on a relatively small number of college campuses were cited as evidence of this supposed crisis. A few particularly alarming anti-Semitic incidents received intense media coverage, such as when Jewish students at Cornell University had to shelter in their dorm rooms after horrific graphic threats were anonymously posted on an online student discussion forum, threatening, among other things, to, quote, bring an assault rifle to campus and shoot all you pig Jews. This came from a Cornell undergraduate student who was later convicted for making these threats. These kinds of incidents, which, as I said, happened on a relatively small number of campuses, were folded into a narrative that universities in general had become hostile environments for Jewish students.
But they have become hostile environments.
Excuse me, can we keep the discussion for later?
Can I?
Please don't interrupt the speaker.
Now, although Jewish students make up only around 3.8% of the entire college student population, the media devoted a hugely disproportionate amount of attention to the feelings and especially the fears of Jewish students. This focus on the fears of Jewish students and the narrative that Jewish students felt threatened by pro-Palestinian campus protests ignored the fact that some Jewish students were enthusiastically participating in and sometimes even organizing these protests. And even more problematically, it ignored the fact that Jewish students weren't the only students feeling unsafe on their campuses. In particular, many Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian students also felt unsafe on their campuses. And there was a surge of Islamophobic, anti-Arab, and anti-Palestinian incidents on and off college campuses in the months after October the 7th. For instance, in November 2023, an Arab Muslim student at Stanford University was deliberately struck by a car on campus in a hit-and-run attack after attending a pro-Palestinian event, and 3 Palestinian students were shot in Burlington, Vermont, leaving one of them permanently paralyzed. These incidents, however, received far less media coverage. In fact, in the media, the fears of Muslim college students and Arab college students received very, very little, if any, attention. Politicians, particularly Republican politicians, also played a key role in stoking this moral panic by constantly condemning what they characterized as rampant anti-Semitism on college campuses. Florida's governor, for example, Ron DeSantis, Republican governor, who previously had refused to denounce a series of neo-Nazi demonstrations that took place in his state, publicly denounced what he called the appalling environment at American universities and claimed that universities have been, quote, captured and corrupted by a woke agenda, thereby linking the issue of campus anti-Semitism to the Republican crusade against wokeness. DeSantis was then competing for the Republican presidential nomination. And he said during this competition that he would revoke the visas of foreign students who supported Hamas if he became president. His then rival for the Republican nomination, Donald Trump, then followed up with making the same promise, which, as we see, he has been fulfilling. It wasn't only Republican presidential candidates seeking voters and donors who seized on the issue of campus anti-Semitism. It was also and especially Republicans in Congress. They really became the self-proclaimed protectors of Jewish students and the sharpest critics of campus administrators. Elise Stefanik, for example, a high-ranking Republican congresswoman from New York, really became the most outspoken on the issue. Now, she'd run campaign ads back in 2022 that echoed the white nationalist Great Replacement conspiracy theory. And she'd repeatedly demonized the Jewish bogeyman, George Soros. But when it came to campus anti-Semitism, she was railing against it. She wrote on one occasion, universities across America have become hotbeds of anti-Semitism. She raised her political profile and, in fact, raked in millions of dollars in campaign contributions after she grilled the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania during a very combative 4-hour hearing held by the House Committee on Education and Workforce in December 2023. You may recall her famously asking them, each of them, whether calling for the genocide of Jews violated their university's rules or student codes of conduct, which in fact students were not in fact calling for the genocide of Jews. Each president, though, answered in a very legalistic manner that such calls would only violate their university's rules if the speech became harassment, thereby drawing a legal distinction between protected speech, no matter how offensive or hateful, and prohibited harassment. But this legalistic answer caused an uproar and eventually led to their resignations, the resignations of Harvard's president and UPenn's president. What they didn't realize, what they didn't recognize, is that the congressional hearings were entirely performative. They were a high-profile opportunity for Republicans to attack higher education, not to combat campus anti-Semitism. It was political theater. The hearing that the Republicans held in the House in December was just the first of many such hearings. And these much publicized hearings became an opportunity for Republicans to grill university presidents, often under the glare of the television cameras. And in particular, these hearings focused on a very small number of elite research universities, where only a tiny proportion, just over 1% of the total number of undergraduates in the United States, which number over 20 million, study. If those hearings were seriously aimed at investigating the extent of anti-Semitism on university and college campuses, they would have at very least brought in a much wider array of universities and colleges. Instead, they focused very narrowly on a small number of elite universities. Doing so served their political interests and the ideological agenda of Republican politicians. At a time when populism is ascendant on the American right, attacking elite universities is politically expedient, and aggressively interrogating the leaders of these universities allowed them to present themselves as fighters against these elite universities. And that played well with Republican voters who, surveys show, have increasingly lost trust or confidence in higher education. So the safety of Jewish students became a political weapon that Republican politicians used to discredit American higher education and advance the right's long-running culture war. Universities have long been targets of the American rights culture war, but now right-wing politicians, activists, and talk show hosts seized on anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses to claim that they represented a broader systemic problem in higher education. They used the hearings, for example, to portray universities not only as hotbeds of anti-Semitism, but as bastions of left-wing extremism where woke faculty members indoctrinate and radicalize students. They blamed wokeism, critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, all of these popular targets on the right, for anti-Semitism on college campuses. And these were not new attacks, for example, against DEI programs, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Republicans had already been trying in years prior to ban these kinds of programs. The moral panic around campus anti-Semitism then gave them a useful opportunity to gain more public support for banning those programs. So in addition to the media and Republican and politicians, you also had a new source of pressure. And it came from a small group of major donors who applied financial pressure. These are the mega donors, so-called mega donors, who threatened to stop giving hundreds of millions of dollars to American universities. For example, after Liz McGill's disastrous congressional testimony, the president of UPenn, Ronald Lauder, the Estee Lauder Cosmetics there, paused his donations to UPenn, and another major donor withdrew a planned $100 million donation. Billionaire financier Mark Rowan then played a role in forcing Liz McGill's resignation. At Harvard, Harvard donor and billionaire hedge fund manager Bill Ackman helped oust Harvard's president, Claudine Gay. And billionaire donors to Columbia University, such as the owner of the New England Patriots, Robert Kraft, also threatened to stop giving to the university. So universities then, college and universities, were under both political pressure from particularly Republican politicians, as well as growing financial pressure. All of this reached a crescendo, and the moral panic reached a crescendo in the spring of 2024, when student activists pitched tents and established so-called Gaza solidarity encampments on the campuses of many universities. Students established encampments on more than 130 campuses and in nearly 40 states across the United States. It was the largest wave of student-led protests on American college campuses since the Vietnam War, and evoked many comparisons with the anti-war protests of 1968. The proliferation of these encampments on college campuses marked the culmination and the escalation of months of pro-Palestinian campus activism, involving rallies, walkouts, sit-ins, die-ins, etc., that really culminated in these encampments from coast to coast. And although each encampment was slightly different, they generally made very similar demands, primarily that their university or college cut any academic ties with Israel, disclose their investments in Israel, divest from weapons manufacturers and companies doing business in Israel, and in some cases ban Israeli products from their campuses. In the words of one of the most popular chants of student demonstrators, quote, "Disclose, divest, we will not stop, we will not rest." These encampments received massive media coverage, and especially on cable news channels. And most of this media coverage was highly critical. It often misrepresented what the student protesters believed and what they wanted. Fox News was the harshest in its portrayal of the protesters, regularly describing them as anti-American and pro-Hamas. For example, Fox News host Jesse Waters lambasted what he called, quote, "Hamas brats setting up their terror tents." And although some of the more militant students in the encampments did support Hamas, or at least endorsed its violent resistance against Israel, most of the students in the encampments probably didn't. They were protesting against Israel and what they believed to be its ongoing genocide in Gaza, not for Hamas. Nor were they necessarily motivated by hatred against Jews, though they were often accused of being anti-Semitic. MSNBC host Joe Scarborough even claimed on one of his shows that the students want to, quote, "wipe out all the Jews." The media coverage also grossly exaggerated the impact of these encampments on campus life. For example, on May 1st, 2024, CNN's chief political correspondent, Dana Bash, opened her show, a primetime show, stating, "We start with destruction, violence, and hate on college campuses across the country." Fox News host Sean Hannity even referred to the campus protests as a, quote, "insurrection," a term that he didn't use to describe the actual insurrection that occurred on January 6, 2021, which he called merely a riot. Now, the encampments were disruptive, as protests tend to be, but they were peaceful and they did not cause the mayhem that the media often claim they did. A small number of students participated in these encampments. They were not as widespread as they were portrayed to be, and they didn't upend campus life in the way that these reports suggested. They took place, in fact, at just a fraction of the total number of colleges and universities in the United States. Primarily, as I said, at more selective colleges and universities that enrolled fewer students from moderate and low-income families. They were most common at more elite universities and colleges, and it was at these institutions that received by far the most coverage. Not only did the media hype the threat of these encampments, but Republicans in Congress vociferously denounced them. Senator Tom Cotton, for example, described the protest encampments as, quote, disgusting cesspools of anti-Semitic hate, full of pro-Hamas sympathizers, fanatics, and freaks. He even demanded that President Biden send National Guard troops onto college campuses to protect Jewish students, apparently either unaware of what happened at Kent State University on the 4th of May 1970, when 4 students were shot dead and 9 wounded by National Guard during a protest against the Vietnam War, or possibly unconcerned about the danger that armed troops might pose to student protesters. Now, this coverage, the very critical coverage, and the political backlash undoubtedly shaped or affected American public opinion towards those encampments. Nearly half of American adults surveyed in May of 2024, and the majority of those aged 65 and over thought that the campus protests were anti-Semitic. And politically conservative Americans were much more likely to regard the protests as anti-Semitic than were more liberal Americans. Similarly, as I said, older Americans were much more likely to regard the campus protests as anti-Semitic than were younger Americans, including those students who are actually on these campuses. But the safety of Jewish students became an urgent national issue. And it was something that Republicans, many Democrats as well, and a host of advocacy groups demanded that university administrators take care of. Under intense pressure, intense external pressure, many university administrators therefore made the safety of Jewish students on their campuses a priority. And sometimes it seemed, in fact, that they were more concerned about the safety or the fears of some Jewish students on their campuses than they were about the actual threats that other students faced, such as doxing and death threats. They showed little, if any, concern for the safety of the student protesters themselves. The most shocking example of this occurred on my own campus at UCLA, where the encampment on UCLA's campus, which had been around for just a few days, was violently attacked one night by a seemingly pro-Israel mob, who spent more than 4 hours besieging this encampment, shooting fireworks into it, trying to tear down the makeshift barricades that surrounded it, and armed with metal rods and baseball bats, beating protesters as well as student journalists and spraying them in the face with bear mace and pepper spray, while campus security and local police stood by for hours watching without intervening, ignoring the protesters' pleas for help. And the police made no arrests that night. Dozens of UCLA students, including some of my students, were injured in that encampment, including 25 who were hospitalized. And the very next day, the administration compounded its failure to protect its own students by then asking the police to clear the protest encampment after the students refused to leave voluntarily. So the next night, police officers in full riot gear stormed the encampment, firing stun grenades and rubber bullets, beating protesters with batons. Numerous protesters were again injured, at least 25 were hospitalized, and over 200 were arrested that night. The UCLA administration was not the only administration by any means that called in the police to clear protest encampments. In fact, at the request of administrators, police forcefully dismantled the encampments on over 80 campuses, and more than 3,200 student and faculty protesters were arrested at universities and colleges across the United States. This was the largest number of people arrested in campus protests in the United States in over 50 years, since the student protests against the Vietnam War in the late 1960s, which were often more disruptive and sometimes violent. But it's not only the number of arrests that stands out, but also the degree of force that accompanied them. On many campuses, students and faculty protesters were thrown to the ground and zip-tied by armed police officers wearing body armor. They were beaten with batons, tear gassed, pepper sprayed, and even shot with rubber bullets. At Dartmouth College, Annalise Orlick, a 65-year-old Jewish professor who was the former chair of the college's Jewish Studies department, was thrown to the ground by riot police, knelt on, dragged along the grass, zip-tied, and arrested after she demanded that a police officer give her back her cell phone, which she'd been using to record the arrests. Now, this repression by the police at the request of university and college administrators was often justified on the grounds that the protest encampments were a threat to the safety of Jewish students. So ironically, the moral panic over campus anti-Semitism ended up jeopardizing the safety of students inside the encampment, including Jewish students who were in those encampments. Without this moral panic, university leaders would not, I think, have been under the kind of pressure they were to crack down on pro-Palestinian protests on their campuses, and their actions may well have been less draconian. The repressive measures, the repressive response that many universities and colleges, not all, but many, took to overwhelmingly peaceful student protests would surely have been different in many cases if these protests had not been framed as anti-Semitic by the media and politicians, or if many members of the public, parents, alumni, donors, and trustees, had not become so convinced and so worried that they endangered Jewish students. As with many other moral panics, the panic over campus anti-Semitism not only resulted in police repression, but also in other repressive measures taken by administrators. Calling in riot police was just the most blatant measure with the most violent consequences. University administrators have also clamped down not only on encampments, but on pro-Palestinian campus activism in general. Pro-Palestinian student activists involved in organizing protests on their campuses have been suspended, banned from campus, evicted from their dorms, and in some cases expelled. Some students were disciplined for much less than this. For example, a student at Barnard College in New York faced disciplinary charges merely for hanging a Palestinian flag from her dorm room. More broadly, the moral panic over campus anti-Semitism has led university administrations to impose much more restrictive regulations on when, where, and how student protests can take place on their campuses. Many have prohibited encampments. Some have prohibited protests taking place near the entrances of campus buildings, while others have prohibited protests taking place after sunset. And while students have borne the brunt of this repression, faculty have been far from immune. They've been investigated, disciplined, suspended, and even fired in some cases for what they wrote on some social media. This all began before Trump returned to the White House in January 2025. By the time he took office then, the dominant narrative that there was a crisis of anti-Semitism on American college campuses had been firmly established in the mind of the American public, especially among Republican voters, who believed that universities had failed miserably to protect Jewish students from rampant anti-Semitism. And this opened the door for the Trump administration to carry out its aggressive and unprecedented assault on pro-Palestinian speech and on elite universities. It gave the administration the justification and the domestic support that it needed to do so. If this ongoing assault succeeds, it will not only have a chilling impact on pro-Palestinian campus activism, but also on free speech on campuses in general, on academic freedom, and on the autonomy of universities. And it will do nothing to make Jewish students safer or even feel more comfortable as Zionists on college campuses. On the contrary, it risks making Jewish students scapegoats, as their fellow students and perhaps even some faculty could blame them for complaining about anti-Semitism and therefore for being somehow complicit in the Trump administration's campaign. So rather than reducing campus anti-Semitism, this assault could actually make it worse. Thank you.